I'm going to hit the pause button in the recording just for a couple of minutes. Okay, good morning or good afternoon, everybody. I just hit the recording button for us to get started. My name is Bill Coakley. This is BSMA's one of several webinars that we've had for the past few months, and will continue at a rate of about one a month for the rest of this year. These webinars will explore best practices and solutions to supply chain challenges around topics such as clinical supply planning, tools and technologies, data analytics, and commercialization of new products. Time will be put aside at the end of this session for Q&A. If anyone has questions, please type them in the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen. The chat section has been turned off. Also, there's no need for you to hit that raise your hand button. The event is being recorded. Copies of the webinar will be distributed to everyone that registered for this event about 1 to 2 weeks after this webinar. So without further ado, I'm going to be turning this over to Stacy Erickson, our facilitator.
Thanks, Bill. If you can just keep sharing, it'd be great. We're just going to do some quick introductions. I first wanted to thank Ryan and Sebastian, who are the workstream leaders for the clinical supply and demand planning workstream under BSMA. And through their leadership, we are putting on these webinars, as Bill spoke to. And this one will be on the perspectives of S&OP in the clinical space. We have a great team of panelists. They offer different perspectives, all from different companies, and utilizing S&OP in the clinical supply and demand planning space in different ways. I'm going to start with John and have him introduce himself.
Hi, everyone. My name is John Miller. I'm currently the Senior Director, Head of Supply Chain and Procurement at Wugen. We are an early stage, so phase 1 company in the, we have a CAR T and NK program, so cell therapy space. And we kicked off an S&OP or clinical operations planning process about a year ago. So look forward to sharing more with you today.
Thanks, John. Eliana, do you want to go ahead?
Sure. Hello, everyone. My name is Eliana Russo, and I am currently working at Novartis. My role is that of CS&OP facilitator. We rolled out the process a couple of years ago with a staggered approach. So we are still, for some modalities, in a rollout phase, and we will talk soon more about what we're doing and how, and the challenges and the interesting aspects of this rollout.
Thank you, Eliana. And then Laura.
Hi, everyone. I'm Laura Shuga. I work for Bayer, the Director of Long-Term Planning at the Berkeley site. And so we are working on developing our clinical S&OP or clinical IBP process. We have a robust commercial process that's used at Bayer, and so we're adapting a lot of those things into the clinical space. So look forward to talking more.
Thank you. I'll serve as a facilitator today. I'm Stacy Erickson, a director with Clarkson Consulting, and I'm one of our life sciences supply chain leaders. I have about 25 years across supply chain, and I'm always excited to talk about these topics that really we can all learn from each other, plus just see how it's being applied across the industry. So we will give a quick introduction on the next slide, Bill, just to the topic, and then it'll be our last slide. You'll be able to. So it's just to kind of maybe level set first all really quickly. Sales and operation planning. You've probably seen many different visuals, many different ways to talk about what is sales and operation planning. I think what's important is it is a decision-making process, right? It does allow companies to balance their demand and supply with some very important inputs. And so when we think about it, I think you'll hear a lot about the cross-functional nature of this process. about the executive buy-in for this process, and about different things coming together. So when we think about, demand and demand consensus, feeding supply and supply consensus to allow for that executive review decisions that you really have the right production plan, with the financials and data being so central to it. And all of this really does become an evolution, right? Where do you start? How do you crawl, walk, run into this process? And often I think companies, see this within their commercial space, but today we wanted to focus on the clinical side to see what might have been learned or might be different in the ways that you apply it in the clinical space. So as Bill said in the beginning, please, prep some questions, put them in the Q&A. We're going to go through and talk about kind of 3 key areas. The panelists will, answer some different questions and give their perspective, but please, be noting down your questions and we will get to them at the end. Okay, Bill, I think if we can take the presentation down if we want. Yeah, that's perfect. And we'll just get in to a couple questions. So I'm going to start with Eliana. And Eliana, we're going to, let's talk a little bit in the beginning just about the process kind of used to develop S&OP in the clinical space, and then maybe any KPIs that were developed to kind of help support that process.
Mm-hmm. Right, yeah. Let me start first saying that what we decided to do in the research and development area here at Novartis is that of not focusing only on the clinical part. So what we wanted to achieve was an overview for the process for the whole of the technical research and development. So we don't want to focus only on the clinical aspects or supplying the clinics for the clinical studies, but we want to have an overarching overview on the whole portfolio and all the dynamics around the development projects, right? So the perspective we took was kind of 360 degrees, still working, of course, around the principle of S&OP. So following this cycle that you just showed, Stacy, right? Going through the portfolio review to look at the dynamics of the projects we have in our space and identify how these dynamics can then influence the next steps of the monthly process, right? And looking at the usual demand review to address the changes and the triggers behind the changes to then end up, let's say, in the first part of the cycle into the supply review to assess, okay, are the capacities installed, are they able to support what we want to achieve? And then, going ahead with potential risk identification and escalation to the next step of the process, still the fifth one, which is the executive, let's call it like that, the management business review for the finalization of the single set of demand and supply. When it comes to the KPIs, the decision we took at the beginning was that of first stabilizing the backbone of the process, right? Ensuring that we were able to have a single set of demand and supply data for the whole organization. And now we are in the phase of setting the KPIs for the different parts of the process. And we decided to start with a few of them for each of the key steps. I would say the ones we are finalizing now are the most important, probably related to the demand part of the process. It's forecast accuracy and forecast bias, right? I mean, that's the entry step to ensure we have stable, reasonable, forecast and demand data, right, for supporting the rest of the process. But then moving to the supply part, we want to focus on the capabilities we have, right? So we are looking into the utilization rate, for example, for the internal facilities, but we also are looking into the how good are we in delivering, right? The on time in full, the OTIF KPI is another one we are rolling out. I mean, there's more to come, of course, because we want to grow and develop further and get more mature. So we're looking in perspective also to other kind of KPIs that can help us monitoring the inventory and how we use the inventory, right? So, I mean, we can have a couple of other examples. We have, let's say, work in progress, inventory projection, inventory evaluation, and inventory coverage, for example. but let's say we want to take it easy, right? First, let's implement the key ones, look at how they can help us stabilize further the process, and then we will roll out the next ones. But having a clear mind of what we would like to achieve, of course, in the course of next year and a half.
That's great. That's great. You brought up such an interesting point to an inventory and inventory tracking and reporting and monitoring, because whenever we see these S&OP visuals like we looked at, it's almost like an inherent given that you've got control of your inventory, right? But that is such a important part of that cycle that just kind of gets baked in. So thanks for mentioning that. And the ever important forecast accuracy, which yes, nice place.
Right.
Laura, did you want to maybe add some thoughts from your side and what Bayer is seeing as far as kind of like just developing and KPIs and things like that?
Yeah, sure. So our process is a little bit newer, I think, than what Elena just described. So we just started this around last year. And as I mentioned, we're trying to build it from the commercial process that we use all across Bayer, and kind of making an IBP light version for the clinical space. So we're looking to, of course, expand that to our development groups and tech transfer groups that are involved. Right on the onset, we're also involving finance and budget related topics, because we definitely saw a need for alignment across all these different groups of what we're doing, what is the plan, and where we're working towards. So I think a term that comes up a lot is this single source of truth for clinical planning, what the plan is to make sure that from a supply chain perspective, we're planning all our materials, our inventory strategy, developing that inventory policy for clinical, as well as aligning with what our production volumes are compared to budget, to make sure all of these different products and technical projects are on track. We also, as far as KPIs, we're in the very early stages of looking at those KPIs. As I mentioned, inventory is one of those we're looking at. We're slowly developing looking at schedule adherence as well as capacity utilization. So one thing I think we're making unique about the clinical compared to what we're doing with commercial is really moving our supply chain design very upstream in the process. So we're looking at capacity questions and potential risk to capacity early on to be able to make those, if we have potential launch demands and looking out into the future, we can try and see, do we have potential capacity issues that need to be addressed early on, perhaps focuses for development and things like that. So really kind of expanding that to be able to have the full future look.
I'm going against my own rule here, but I feel like there's a question that came in that's like really applicable, Laura, to yourself. So I'm just gonna bounce onto your thing here, because I think from your side, you kind of have a commercial process that you're bringing kind of into clinical, right? And trying to adopt into this area to make sure. And the question is like, what's the major difference between clinical and commercial, or what are you seeing the major difference there?
I think for one, we need to get full alignment on the decision-making process and who's involved. What the biggest difference is that we're involving development in these technical groups that do not have as much as experience or exposure to a lot of the business processes that we see in commercial. And so there are a lot of concerns said around a lot of the budgeting, our inventory management, risk mitigation, things like that we're trying to bring in for everyone to be on the same page within those development and technical groups. So I think that's one of the bigger decisions, the bigger differences. But the other is also the sheer amount of uncertainty around the clinical planning process. The demands can be really all over the place. A program can stop at any moment. We might have new things coming on. And so the planning is a little bit different in that way. It has to be a lot more open, a little bit more scenario planning, or be able to adjust and be flexible. So I think that's also what makes the adaptation of KPIs a little more difficult as well. So, yeah.
Thank you. I might going to take one of the ideas you had and jump over to Jonathan. So Laura and Eliana both talked a little bit, Jonathan, about kind of like cross-functional, and Laura used single source of truth, which we hear. And often that requires, kind of buy-in and change management to get your organization there. Can you talk to us a little bit about what you've seen on kind of the change management side in bringing S&OP into the clinical space?
Sure. Yeah, no, Stacey, that's a great question. I think for our company, so we're, just to put it in perspective for everybody, so we're just under 100 people. Again, we're a clinical stage phase 1 company. Right now, we're outsourcing 100% of our manufacturing, and a lot of our management was mostly from academia. So this whole operations, process, governance, you start using these terms, and you initially see like an allergic reaction from some people. So I think that's one key factor, right? So kind of bringing in more process, more routine, operations kind of mindset. I think second, it's, I think Laura hit the nail on the head, having a single source of truth, right? We have our clinical team thinking one thing, we have our operations team planning for something else, right? So they're kind of like natural, I guess, factors kind of showing that there was, we were having some challenges. And I think the third kind of factor was, our investors, our board, were asking questions. Finance was regularly looking at, budget, and we didn't have a great way of forecasting. So I think kind of the culmination of those three factors was really, our problem statement and showing that we needed to do something, right? And I think what we initially did is we kicked it off with, before board meetings, I developed a model. And then we created an S&OP light process initially just before board meetings. So we had it on a quarterly process, I think twice. And then after the second one, I was like, all right, yeah, we realized we need to do this on a regular basis to really kind of focus on the internal alignment as well. But yeah, I think that was the key for us, is really showing that there was a problem, and then that there is value added by actually having this type of process and governance set up.
Do you kind of utilize a process to kind of report back on that value add that's allowed like that buy-in to continue? Is there anything you'd add there around just, kind of consistently, I don't know, consistently being able to show the value as you move forward?
Yeah, no, great question. So I think now we have a monthly process where we review, we have a demand meeting, we have a supply meeting, we pull it all together in a monthly S&OP where we are reviewing, are there any gaps? This is our current operating plan for the company. And that gets reported out on a monthly cadence, right? So I think just having that and having that alignment has been, showing the value add.
Yeah, keeps that consistent messaging going.
Exactly.
That's great. That's great. Eliana, what about from your side? I know you've been working on it a few years, but what have you seen from kind of change management, org buy-in? How do you ensure you have that cross-functionally?
Well, I would start maybe first saying that in our environment, in the clinical space, in the research and development space, rolling out an S&OP process is not simply really rolling out a process. It's really triggering a mindset change, at least based on my experience. Because Laura was touching a point earlier, for example, saying, in commercial, you're used to following specific business processes, maybe more used also to supply chain processes. That's kind of the bread and butter, right, for almost everybody in the commercial environment. While in the clinical space and in research and development, that's maybe not the case. So you need to really, I would say, the biggest challenge is showing what is the benefit that the effort that rolling out such a process can help you achieving, right? So being clear, ensuring that management, but also all the stakeholders that are involved are clear with what's there at stake for them, right? Because at least what I've noticed is that in order to implement such a process, you need really to move from a kind of silo thinking, right, line function oriented way of thinking to a cross-functional one. And of course, moving from the first to the second one requires a kind of, breaking the barriers, but also cooperating, collaborating. So you kind of need to show what is the benefit. Once the benefit is visible, and the first benefit is having the transparency in the end on the demand and supply requirements that your organization has, then everything gets easier, right? It's kind of, you know, making the first step, saying, okay, yeah, this is helping. Indeed, it works. Working cross-functionally works because it helps reducing risks or identifying potential opportunities up front, right? So at that point, it's easier to embark the whole organization to follow. Of course, let's say the step that you need to make might depend on the organization, on the size, on the complexity that you have to manage, right? It's not necessarily an easy step, I believe. But once you're able to make that step, it's engaging for the whole organization.
Thanks, Ileana. I have a quick question, maybe back to you, John. So thinking about this, maybe the two concepts we've talked about, like development of process and KPIs, and then also this like organizational buy-in. How do you make sure you address that if you've got external manufacturing, or if you're dealing with like CMOs? Are there key KPIs or key things you've had to do to make sure you've got buy-in from these external partners in this process?
Yeah, no, I think for us, we've actually had to, think about this really closely, right? And I think for us, it was, we were running out of capacity with our current suite, so that was something that when looking at, our 12-month projections, we could see that there was going to be a gap with our current run rate within the current suite, right? So then we had to reach out to the CDMO to either request a second suite if there was capacity, or potentially look at a different CDMO. So I think including them, in the process is absolutely critical for success. But that's essentially what we did on our side. But we didn't have any specific, we weren't tracking utilization, as much. We were mainly looking at turnaround time. And, as Eliana pointed out, on time and full. They weren't our own teams, but, they're an extension of our network.
Yeah, almost similar to if it were your internal manufacturing, right? It becomes such an important cog in the
and success rate as well. So we're looking at yields, we're looking at
Right.
success rates, turnaround times that are key inputs to the process.
Great. Thanks. We'll take a short pivot into technology, and there actually was a Q&A on technology too, so it's probably will maybe help address that as well. I think just maybe talking about, some of the tools or technology you've been using. Excel is a tool, so that's okay if that's the answer, right? We all know that a lot of times it starts there, but I just want to know kind of a little bit about where your company either has invested or thinking about investing, and what technology or tools you've seen that have been able to help you in this space. So Laura, do you mind if I start with you on that topic?
Sure. So we use the main tool is around our mid and long-term capacity planning. So we have a midterm capacity tool, some specialized software that's used by Bayer for this type of planning. And because it's standardized across the company, we're again trying to adapt it to clinical planning as well. And we're using this to help look at, as we're growing our manufacturing facilities and developing those, we're trying to really be able to use it as for decision framing and for making those types of capacity decisions, identifying risks, using it for resource planning. And so it's that overall model, and the output of the model is part of our clinical supply review meeting in a way, so that we can share this the unified plan, and then also the different scenarios, and so that each group can then take that information for whatever type of planning they need as well. So of course we try and stay away from Excel planning as much as possible, but some of the detailed stuff we're working on as well. In the future, Bayer is looking towards going to a fully integrated midterm planning, along with all of our production work as well, but we haven't. That's expected to roll out within the next couple of years.
John, I might jump over to you, and I might just add a little bit to the question for you, and just a thought of what you've been using, but also any thoughts on like when companies should invest in technology, as you're kind of thinking about what you've done and what you've seen maybe at different companies.
Yeah, no, great question. I think so for us, as I mentioned, we're a relatively small company now, so I think for us, it's really, again, I mentioned the whole kind of, resistance initially, just given the lack of operations, big company experience. So I think for us, it was really right sizing, it's the tools, but then also our process, right sizing it for our company size, right? So we're still, using Excel, and, it's working well for us now. I think you brought up a good question of, when is the right time? So I think the interesting thing about the cell therapy space, opposed to your traditional biologics, is our, I know it's always typically your supply obviously can have an big impact on your demand, but we're having like very small production runs, where we're constantly having to really balance this and look really closely. And, I think having an Excel model gives us that flexibility now for us to really kind of, do the detailed planning, and then, also do the long range planning as well, without having like a cumbersome tool. So I think it's working for now. As far as kind of what would be a good inflection point, I would say that's to be continued. And I would kind of rely on some of, our maybe Laura, Elena for some of their experience. But I mean, what we're doing now is working, and, I would think that it'd really be by, number of production runs per year, would be like a good measure. And, for us, we're still, under 50, so I'm thinking, if we get to like over 100 runs per year, then that would probably be a time to really start thinking about, what that next tool platform could look like, unless we start to see the challenges, or just the day-to-day becomes too cumbersome with what we're currently doing.
Eliana, any thoughts on the same topic here around technology, when to invest, how you've invested at Novartis?
Well, I believe that the trigger for investing in a planning tool is definitely linked to the complexity of the portfolio you have to manage, right? I mean, in the end, it has to counterbalance what's the investment that you make with the tool, but not only with the tool, also with the resources needed to develop it, implement it, and then sustain it, right? So as a company, you need to find the right balance between these two. And I think the trigger is definitely the complexity that you have to manage. I would say that's my perspective on this topic, definitely.
And sometimes, so Laura, to your point, how integrated is your solution going to be, right? And so when the company's ready to invest, are you demand, supply, inventory, production? Are you going for a portion of that? And I think we see to all of your points that complexity sometimes drives where companies invest, right? Depending on what needs to be managed. Often you see this kind of supply inventory side come first, right? But sometimes that having that fully integrated early on can give you a nice just overall way to have all bought into that again single source of truth.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, Stacy, because the driver on our side was because it's an integrated tool, so that we can have kind of that continuum with our planning in the clinical space. But as something launches into commercial, we already have both the tools and processes set up for that, so that we can easily move into that. But it is a challenge because at times that can be a little bit over-engineered if you're only doing a few runs a year. So it is kind of that balance of what's needed versus looking to the future as well.
Absolutely. There's a great question that came in as a little bit of a different topic, which I like, and I'm sure one of you will have a thought on it. When you think about working in kind of clinical supply planning and kind of in this world of uncertainty, right? And with fluid demand and probably some challenging internal and external conversations, what kind of candidates are you looking for when you're hiring? Like what kind of, I think the question is a little bit those competencies you're looking for when hiring. Any of you with thoughts on that and people you're bringing into your organizations?
Yeah, maybe I could jump in. I think maybe one thing we've really noticed is that a broad range of competencies are, of course, really important. I think one thing about the clinical space, there's a lot of ambiguity in both the demands, the planning, and what needs to be done. Sometimes every product or project can be a little bit different. And so we look for competencies that maybe knowledge in different areas, some project type work focusing on being able to work with many different groups, get alignment, and pull things together. I think even in the supply chain space, that could be very relevant for some of the work for clinical planning.
Anyone else thoughts on when you're hiring or competencies or experience you're looking for?
I would say definitely I agree with Laura. I mean, trying and find different profiles in a way to also build let's say quite complete team. But I believe also one direction that is getting stronger and stronger is also that of leveraging on the commercial supply chain knowledge in a way, right? To use also that knowledge to make the processes we were talking earlier about, which are maybe not that strong or stable in the clinical environment, to support in enhancing them and making them more robust. So that's definitely an element that is a key one for hiring.
Yeah. I've started to kind of answer a few of the questions that have come in as we've been talking. So for the audience, please continue to submit any questions you have in Q&A. They've been great, and we'll continue to answer some of the ones we have here. We have a question around whether formal organizational change management is being used. I just wanted to ask if anyone had a thought on that. I would also add on, like, how do you educate your people about S&OP?
Training, support.
Yeah, we did road shows. I basically, similar to the slides you set up, I put together a road show, just kind of, what is S&OP, who's involved, what's, consensus-based, single point of truth process, really just kind of spelling it out. And then, did that with all of the key functional areas, and then really just continuing to work with them. I think not only educating the people that you're working with, but then also the management. Once you start putting together graphs of your supply versus demand, kind of taking some time to sit down with them so they fully understand what they're looking at, I think was really helpful for me, because I didn't do that initially. And then I got a ton of questions and I was like, all right, I need to do a little more, socializing before our next meeting, particularly when you get with, C-level and, your executive teams, just making sure everybody's fully understanding what you're presenting.
I love this idea of road shows and getting with the functions individually, because you're right. You'll sit down and maybe an S&OP executive review and, assume you're all talking, to the same thing. And yes, then all the questions start, right? And so you realize backing up, making sure everyone's got the same education. And I think you find maybe one of you have a perspective on this, but obviously all the functions bring a little bit of a different hat to the table. That's why you want them there, right? But they're thinking different things. And it's really, if you're the owner of this process, how to make sure you're kind of addressing each of those hats or those needs within your process. And sometimes that has to be done more one-on-one, more individually, at least in that beginning stage.
Yeah, we don't have any formal organizational change management for this, but I kind of agree with something Eliana said earlier about just showing that the process works, and that in of itself, kind of advocates for having it. So, there's often a lot of confusion about what is the plan. There are many different plans going on beforehand, and now as groups are starting to realize there's one plan. This is where I go for it. This is where we can get it, and that we're all working to the same thing. Even that alone has kind of shown its value and brought more people to the table and in agreement on kind of moving this process forward. So I think that's helped as well.
What we did, it's two things in a way. The first one was at the very beginning when we started working on the process. We involved in the definition of the process each, let's say, a stakeholder for each line function that takes part to the process itself, so that we would define the process, not just one way, but considering all the requirements also of the different line functions. And that was at the very beginning. When we rolled out the process, we put together a very basic, I would say, package of training. It was a web-based training that is then available for understanding the basics and the key elements of S&OP. And then we've been presenting regularly in the different line functions the expectations and what it is about and how the process works. And let's say this package helped to start with. Of course, then the maintenance is also important, right? It's not that you roll it out once and everything is set. You also need to sustain and maintain and adapt whenever you make adjustments to parts of the process, or when you improve some areas, right? You need to retrain, repeat the messages to make sure that the organization absorbs them.
Yeah, great. Well, from one of our BSMA leaders, Devendra, there's a question about some of these amazing cutting edge technology we're seeing these days in generative AI or machine learning algorithms. And he's wondering if we think that these algorithms could help improve planning and forecasting, knowing that there's so much historical data, especially at larger companies. May not be as much for you, John, on the historical data, but I don't know, Eliana or Laura.
I love the idea, and I'm excited to hear from Laura and Eliana how they're thinking of applying that.
Right.
I mean, sure. This could help, and I think we are trying to go as digital and automated as possible in our planning and forecasting. So Bayer Pharma is looking towards implementing OMP in the future that will fully integrate our planning, like I mentioned, and automate a lot of these types of things that we're maybe doing in offline tools. And things like that. So the more that we can apply these things, the easier and hopefully more accurate a lot of our planning and forecasting will be. So yeah, I think there's a lot of opportunities there.
Yeah, I have to say I'm not an expert myself in this area, but I strongly believe that particularly to start with in the forecasting area, we could definitely move forward. And actually, I'm looking forward seeing the first, let's say, impact of this. I think that would be the starting point, looking, how this can help us on the forecasting side.
Going forward.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a great question. You definitely hear it as a potential use case, right, for algorithms and AI is in this demand in forecasting. So I think we're probably all on the edge of our seat, Devendra, hoping to see it come into play soon. We all know it could happen. I'm going to go back to a question. This really, I think, comes down to, does anyone have a secret sauce? Does anyone have a secret to share about how you establish confidence in your demand, since clinical is so fluid?
$1 million question.
If you have the secret, you should share it, because this is a friendly group. I feel like it is the $1 million question for sure.
I believe that, oh, sorry.
No, go ahead. I was just pausing, hoping someone had the right answer.
I don't know if I have the right answer, but I strongly believe that whenever you start measuring the quality of your data, regardless, now we're talking about forecasting, but in general, and then use this KPI to understand what is, triggering that specific behavior, and then take actions. That's the obvious process that will help understand, but also improve the data and then enhance the confidence. It's definitely not, let's say one, let's say it's maybe not the secret recipe, right? It's not that secret, but I believe in the data analysis and in the root cause analysis to establish trust in and confidence in the data we use all along the cycle and in general for any activity we do.
I think it's a brilliant answer, because if you don't measure it, you can't improve it, right? So knowing it is kind of one of the biggest challenges. If you at least get really disciplined about your data and measuring and communicating on it, you have a chance, right, to improve it. So I think it's brilliant. Laura, John, any other thoughts on the secret sauce of demand accuracy in the clinical?
I think that was a great answer. And I think also the idea of, shared KPIs or transparent KPIs on topics like that help hold groups accountable and help that kind of be at the forefront of what we're looking at to make sure so that groups understand the impact of unreliable demands and what they have upstream for our planning. And so if you're able to show that, everyone has that visible and able to kind of all be on one team towards trying to make that better. I think that could help.
That's awesome. Great question. Thank you. And thanks for the thoughts. Another great question here to share a little bit more about where clinical planning falls in your company's overall org chart. So is the question is kind of, is it part of finance or supply chain, or is it a standalone department? Where does it kind of report up under? Any of you who have a thought? I'm sure you all have. Maybe it's different for each of you too. So
Who wants to start? I mean, for us, it reports into me, right? So I have clinical planning under me, and I think it works for our company. I don't know that the larger companies, I don't know, Lara, Eliana, do you want to speak to?
And John, functionally, where do you report? Like, what's your reporting?
I report to our COO, so within operations.
Operations unit. Yep. Okay. Great. Let's see. Yeah.
Ours is within supply chain. So we have our clinical planning within our site supply chain at this time, but it is. This has been something we're kind of working towards and aligning. A lot of clinical planning before has been within the development groups as well. And so we're trying to transition a lot of that planning into supply chain so that we can standardize across the site. And so we're moving that way as well.
So you kind of had like pockets of planning going on within different development groups or clinical groups, I guess you could call it. And that's now, so you're looking at a like centralized.
Yes, so we brought it for our site that operates both clinical and commercial manufacturing. We have our supply chain now is expanded to support the full site. And so that all planning supports both of those organizations so that we can better and more efficiently manage things like our inventory, purchasing and planning.
Eliana, anything different from your side or similar?
Yes. So we, first of all, in our case, we are totally separated from commercial supply chain, and we are part of the technical research and development organization, and we are a global function. So supply chain is done centrally, overseeing basically end-to-end the supply from the kit up to the drug substance for whatever is needed for the technical research and development.
Do you also, Liana, similar there to Laura, she noted that where commercial and clinical, then the planning is coming together, where you have shared products, shared resources, do you bring your commercial clinical planning together?
Yeah, what we do is we consolidate the requirements for the technical research and development, so clinical plus technical requirements, and we hand over our demands basically to then the commercial units for the supply assessment, basically. And then the loop is closed with their feedback on the feasibility in the end.
Makes sense. Very good, very good. There are some other questions that have come in. Yeah, well, one just came in on that same kind of topic. Thoughts on harmonizing clinical, commercial, the parts of the process that kind of touch both, including harmonizing any technology or data. So Eliana, you gave a little bit of answer. Any other thoughts on harmonizing between commercial and clinical from Laura or John? Process, technology, or data harmonization?
Let's see. I think for harmonizing across process-wise, when we're looking from a supply chain perspective, and our inventory safety stock policies, and as well as some of our budgeting processes as well. So we're trying to make those budgeting processes for clinical very transparent, so that everyone's aligned on the spend, the risk that we're taking, potential costs or write-off risks down the road. And so some of that we're trying to harmonize, so that we can, as you know, material sharing could come into play as well.
It's such a step in maturity to try to bring together your commercial and clinical find those places.
Yeah.
Good. This has been excellent. There are a couple more questions. So I'll put one or two more out there. And then if there's any kind of closing thoughts from the group or Bill, we can open it up. So I think John, you touched on this a little bit earlier, but there's a question just about what extent are drug manufacturing organizations, and I think the question was meant to be the third-party organizations involved in your supply review, supply consensus.
So for us, I think, to what extent? I mean, we're really just looking at their capacities and, success rates. So then if I know that I need to schedule more runs, with them, then I'm going to start booking those now, right? So I'm really looking at what their capacity is. If they're telling me that they have, if I need to book runs 6 months out, right? I need to have a really good handle on what my projections are. And I think, as Eliana and Laura pointed out, having that data is very important. I mean, we don't have a crystal ball, right? And we never will, right? So it's really trying to rely on what data we have to, project out our success rates, our yields and whatnot with those third parties. And then knowing that, and that's really how we're booking, number of runs that are needed for, to meet our demand.
Thank you. Yeah, it's such an interesting part when you have these third party manufacturing, external manufacturing, obviously capacity, but the more and more you can develop that, their involvement in the process, obviously the more they become part of your partners. I think you touched on it earlier, but and that kind of gets to another question that one of our last questions that came in is how do you coordinate with strategic sourcing and kind of bring them into the process, knowing there is this relationship with suppliers who obviously affect your ability for supply. Any thoughts on coordination with your strategic sourcing organization or global sourcing organization?
We work very closely with them. I think, within our procurement organization, where that falls, and we work closely with them for the future planning, how we're at any ramp up in capacity or production that we're expecting, to make sure that our suppliers also have that capacity to, they're going to need to work on that for negotiations or things like that, and make sure there's no potential showstoppers along the way that could affect our plans. So they're part of our supply chain teams and bringing in new products so that we make sure they're fully informed and aligned through the whole process, actually.
Excellent. Another cross-functional touch point in this amazingly complex process that brings everyone together. Right? Thanks, Laura, for that. I come from a strategic sourcing background myself, so it's so nice to hear that you are tightly partnered. I think those who have to manage the suppliers often can get forgotten, and how important it is, right, into the input of your overall supply and inventory. So great questions from the audience. I appreciate it. They came in a perfect flow. So thanks for that as well. I want to really thank the panelists. It's been great putting together this little webinar. And also, as I say, to Ryan and Sebastian, who run the work stream. Bill, did you want to have any closing thoughts? Don't forget to unmute yourself, Bill.
I was just doing that. Okay, yeah. So first, on behalf of BSMA, I'd like to thank John, Ileana, Laura, and Stacy. Great job on a always interesting topic. As mentioned at the beginning of the hour, we plan to have these webinar sessions about once a month. Our next one, date to be announced, will be on IRT best practices. And lastly, for those of you who are new to BSMA and are interested in joining any of our work stream groups, feel free to email me. We currently have 3 work stream groups. The S&OP session today is part of the clinical supply and demand planning work stream. We also have a group on moving beyond Excel and point solutions. It's more or less a tools and technology. And the third one, transitioning from clinical to commercial to ensure a successful product launch. Very helpful or useful for those who are aspiring to launch their first commercial product. So without any further ado, I'd like to thank everybody also who's attended this session, and I'll be signing off.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Great, thanks everyone.
Thank you.